Welcome back to World War II TV, folks, and joining me today to talk about the third volume, but first chronologically, of his Germany trilogy is Professor Frank McDonough. The Weimar years fills in that vital gap between the end of the Great War and the Nazi rise in the 1930s. And just to prove I'm a bit of a fanboy, here are my three copies there. Unfortunately, I got the second one. I got the American versions. They don't quite look very neat on the shelf, but they are fantastic works. And if you haven't got them, what are you waiting for? The link to the Weimar Republic is in the description below, as you can always find. But I'll bring in Frank now. Good afternoon, Frank. How are you today?
I'm fine, yeah.
So there's a lot to unpack here. The end of the Great War and the Weimar Republic. I mean, I'm going to read my notes here. You're talking about a period of, unparalleled instability. 20 coalition governments, 20 different chancellors, 8 national elections, and no party ever achieving an overall majority. I mean, you couldn't get a more complicated, fraught era than 1918 to 1933. But for people who are watching this, who are more familiar with the war years, what is the Weimar Republic, and how would we define that era, and how did you break it down when you started writing about it?
Well, the Weimar Republic is the period from the declaration of a republic on the 9th of November 1918 and the abdication of the Kaiser Wilhelm, through to the advent of Hitler as Chancellor on the 30th of January 1933. So it was a period between the wartime, having a monarchy, then Germany had a democracy, then they had a dictatorship, and then after the war, the West Germans anyway, were forced to have a democracy. So
Brilliant.
The period really, people would say it's an experiment with democracy. They've never had full democracy before, because before the First World War, Germany was a sort of autocracy, really. It had a parliament, and the parliament was elected by only men over the age of 25 in a first past the post system. But parliament was not sovereign. The monarch could overrule legislation that went on in parliament. So that didn't make it a proper democracy. After 1918, Germany has a democracy that's well ahead of its time. Everybody, male and female, has the vote over the age of 20. They have laws to preserve equality, even for women and for Jews. There is a balance between the trade unions and the employers. There's an arbitration system, compulsory. So the employer puts his or her pay rise to the workers then discuss it, but then the arbitrator says, right, you get an 8%, and the employer has to abide by that. There's a system of sort of devolved local government as well at the same time. It's very much a democratic system at that time. Also, there's a president as well. That person is elected. The first part of the period, 1919 to 25, no election for the president takes place. It's voted on by the Reichstag. But from 25 to 33, the president is elected, and that becomes President Paul von Hindenburg. So Germany, and it has a democratic constitution. But the problem with the constitution was that the drafters of it, who were liberals, mostly liberals, they decided to include something called Article 48. Now, Article 48 wasn't meant to be used against Parliament, but after 1930, President Hindenburg uses Article 48 to suppress the Reichstag, and he virtually rules as a kind of a Kaiser, if you like, in that period. And he destroys democracy even before Hitler comes to power. Some people think, 1933, that's when Hitler comes to power. But the presidential cabinet he creates from 30 to 33, they destroy democracy.
I mean, that's a very good introduction. And we've talked about Hindenburg and Ludendorff and others on this channel before. And I think these days they do get a little bit overlooked because, as you said there yourself, Hitler is to call him a major player in the 20th century is not even getting close to how influential what he did is hanging over all of us. But as you said there, that period between 18 and his rise to power in 33, well, there was a good hope for something new. As you said there, Germany was leading the way there in so many things. And, we did a show about the Luftwaffe fairly recently. I'm talking about how, and the German railway network, German railways went from being a very, as you say, kind of trade unions and fair and equality to being a part of the Nazi mechanism, a decade and a half later. So let's look at that first period. So 1918 to about 1923. This is what I call the era of revolutions and putsches. And the events in Russia affecting things elsewhere in Europe. So I know there's a lot to unpack in a relatively short, YouTube show, but kind of unpack that era for us and take us through the stages.
Well, I think that period you mentioned, 1918 through to 24, it's such a fraught period, really, and a number of factors are involved here. First of all, the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles is enacted in 1919, and the Allies are determined to make Germany pay for the war because, after all, as the French said, the war was fought primarily on German soil. Germany was decimated, but not as much as France and Belgium. Their entire railway system was decimated. Their infrastructure was decimated. So they wanted most of the reparations. These were the payments that the Treaty of Versailles laid out. And they ended up being something like 132 billion, payable in 3 billion chunks until 1983. And Germany had to pay 12% of all its export surplus. So that was an enormous drain on the German economy as well. And Germany couldn't pay. The truth was that there wasn't, now today, even the poorest country in the world can raise bonds on international markets. It's quite easy to do. You just say, I'll give you 21% in 10 years' time, and then they pay you out a bond in the meantime. Now, Germany couldn't do that. The German banks tried to raise bonds with the German people, and they couldn't do it. And they couldn't raise money on the international markets. So what were they going to do? Initially, they just said, look, we can't pay. And so the payments became a problem, really. And the French got more and more infuriated as the years drew on from 21 to 23. And the payments still were not getting paid. It was a bit like, a guy's maxed out his credit card and keeps saying to his lender, give me another year payment holiday. So it was a series of payment holidays. And then the French said, look, you're not paying. We've had enough of this. We're going to take payments in commodities. We're going to invade the Ruhr and take all the iron, the steel, etc., to the value of 3 billion. And this caused an enormous problem in Germany. How was the German government going to agree to this? Now, the Germans, you got to say, and they were sort of categorized like this. The German government was seen like spoiled children. You can't pay. You say you can't pay, but you're not actually cutting expenditure, are you? You say you can't pay, but you're building infrastructure projects, etc. You say you can't pay, you're giving your workers in the public sector, 8% pay rises. So, sales taxes are very low. You won't up the sales taxes. You won't get revenue in some way and pay. Now, the German government wouldn't do that. They decided to do something quite the opposite. They decided to print money. And they built 100 factories. All they did was print money. Imagine it. And so what they did was all of the industrial workers, because they had good unions, they got inflation rises. And because, of course, the inflation was going up and up and up and up and up, it meant printing more and more money. It came to a head in 1923, really. The government told the workers to go on strike effectively, passive resistance, but they financed it through what we would now know as a furlough scheme. They paid them to stay at home. So the French in the Ruhr and the Belgians, they couldn't get any commodities because nobody was working there. And this was costing something like 41 million marks a day by July, August. And so Gustav Stresemann, he's sort of a big character in the book. And he's a major statesman. He's the Gorbachev of Germany in the 1920s. He wants to get on better with the Allies, especially with the French. And so he pulls out of passive resistance, and he says to the Allies, look, create a committee of experts, economic experts. And that's what the Allies do. They appoint a guy called Charles Dawes. He's a banker from Wall Street, and JP Morgan is on the committee as well. And it includes bankers from, all the Allied powers, Britain, Belgium, Italy, Germany has a member, and also Japan. And so they come up with what's known as the Dawes Plan. And the Dawes Plan is pretty simple, really. It asks the Germans to tighten their belts more, so they have to increase sales taxes. The railways are created into bonds. Remember them bonds I was telling you?
Yeah.
This bond works because it's backed up by a mythical mortgage on all of the railways. The dividend payments from the bond mean it does raise the required money. And the Allies agree that the American stock market will give Germany loans, starting with 800 million to help pay the reparations. So this is seismic. Also, a new currency is introduced. First of all, the Rentenmark. That's a kind of currency that binds the way from the mark to the new mark. And then the new mark is introduced. A transition currency it is, the Rentenmark, and that moves the way into the mark in 1925. So Germany then stabilizes, so all of the terrible problems of reparations go away, and Germany becomes, stable. And through Gustav Stresemann, it starts to enter the international community. But there's not just the economic problems that are dogging this new Weimar Republic. It's also, revolutionary upheaval. In 1919, the communists, who are part of the Social Democrats, split away and decide to have a revolution in Berlin. It's called the Spartacist Revolt. They take over the newspaper, the socialist newspaper. They take over a few government buildings. But the government calls on, not the army, because the army doesn't want to get involved, because the Allies are threatening the army with complete disbandment. And so the army's reluctant to get involved in putting down a revolution, because, of course, this won't play well with the Allies. So they recruit the Freikorps. Now, these are trigger-happy ex-soldiers, armed to the teeth, a kind of Wagner group of its day, really. They recruit them to put down this Spartacist revolt, and they do very brutally. In fact, the Spartacist revolt is already put down when the Freikorps go in, but they exact terrible revenge. For example, they kill Rosa Luxemburg, the leader of the USPD, the Communist Party, and they kill Karl Liebknecht. They shoot them both dead. Luxemburg is sort of thrown into a canal. Liebknecht is left outside of an ambulance station. He's dead. So this creates a tremendous schism on the left, really. The left say, why, Herbert, the president, why are you bringing in mercenaries of the right wing to suppress a socialist revolt? So they call his government then social fascists, and they won't have anything to do with them. They won't create coalition governments. Now, this isn't a problem straight away, because, the Herbert can replace the socialist vote with the Catholic Centre Party, for example. But it does become a problem in the early 30s when Hitler is rising, because if they had joined together, there's a possibility they might have created a coalition on the left that might have stopped Hitler coming to power. So it was an important moment. But then the right have a go. So in 1920, a group of renegade officers led by Wolfgang Kapp, they decide to overthrow the Weimar Republic. And they do succeed initially. They take over Berlin. Kapp nominates himself as Chancellor. The sitting government, led by Herbert, flees to Dresden. So for 5 days, he is the Chancellor of Germany. But that is put down not by the army, who say they're not going to go in and shoot on fellow, army officers, they say, which of course gives the army a chance to take over, gives them the rebels a chance to take over. But first of all, the Treasury says that we're not going to sign your checks. so they've got no money. Then the bureaucracy says, we're not going to work with you. Then there's a general strike of the workers all over Germany, and the cap push falls because of the workers. So the first one falls because of the Ebert government siding with the Freikorps, and the second one falls because of the workers. But there are other revolutions as well. There's one in Munich that starts in 1919 when a guy called Kurt Eisner, he's a communist who's the prime minister of Bavaria, he's shot dead by a right-wing member of the Thule Society. There's a revolution breaks out, and a communist government takes power. It's known as the Poets regime, really, led by Ernst Togler, and it's quite a funny thing because he appoints this guy as a foreign minister, and he declares war on Switzerland. He doesn't like listening to bells, so he gets all the phones pulled out of the foreign ministry. He complains.
So there are some weird figures around. I mean, I knew some of the players in your book, but there are some really odd individuals who are involved at this time.
It's quite funny, you know, and for a week they rule, and they do things like they say everyone can withdraw £100 out of a bank account. They open up the universities to anyone. You don't need any qualifications anymore, and they ban history, as they say it's bad for civilization.
Right.
So, and after a week, this government falls and is replaced by a more brutal Red Army faction led by Eugene Levine, and they start to take, you know, reprisals against these right-wing individuals who shot Eisner. They put them in a gymnasium, not a gymnasium where you go to keep fit, but a German school. They're kind of grammar schools are the elite of the German secondary education system, and they shoot them one by one, brutally mutilate them, and this really shocks the local populace in Munich. And then, lo and behold, Herbert sends in the Freikorps again to put this down again. So again, he calls on these mercenaries to put. The crucial thing about that Bavarian revolution, though, is that it brings the right to power in Bavaria, and it gives sort of a chance, if you like, for a right-wing movement to develop. And of course, we know who's in Munich at this time: Adolf Hitler, of course, who starts, you know, who expands the Nazi Party.
So jump in on, you've talked about Munich and Berlin, and Bavaria hasn't come up yet, because a couple of the questions in the sidebar, well, I'll bring a question up, then I'll expand on it. So Ian Carr is saying, any moves to break up Germany into its constituent parts? Because some of the people watching, you know, myself included, to a certain extent, I just think of Germany. But of course, Germany is based on lots of different regions with very different traditions and cultures, and you know, and even today we might define that cities tend to be more left wing, countryside tends to be more right wing, although it's never that simple. During these complicated times of left and right, and what might there have been a solution to break it all up? Was that ever considered or put on the table by anybody?
Bavaria had a separatist movement, so they wanted to, you know, they wanted to break away. A separatist movement started in the Ruhr as well, egged on by the French, really, during the period of the hyperinflation and the occupation. So there were groups who wanted to bring back the power of the states, because of course Germany had federal under the Kaiser. They had all these kings and princes and all that who ruled all these historic areas, you know, like Hanover and Saxony and so on. So some people wanted that back, but not. It wasn't sort of a massive movement, but it was big in Bavaria. And there was calls to bring back the monarch, the Wittelsbach monarchy that existed there, but it wasn't something that it got beyond sort of moaning about it, if you like. You know, it's reckoned that around about 50% wanted the Kaiser back. So that shows you democracy wasn't working that well, even in the middle stable period. But talking about the middle period, you know, it didn't seem like Hitler had a chance in the middle period. Of course, he went to jail because of his involvement in something called the Munich Beer Hall coup, putsch, which took place in November 1923. That was the last of these revolts, if you like. And actually, it was the least important in the sense that it didn't even take over a beer hall, let alone a government. It's elevated in history because of Hitler, because of course the biographies of Hitler elevate everything he does too much, in my view, because what we do is we're overwhelmed with Hitler and we don't see the Weimar political system. We don't see what's happening there that makes Hitler palatable. Unless you understand the political system of Weimar, you don't understand why Hitler rises. And that's what I've tried to do in this book.
Exactly.
You've seen, I've tried to go into the political system, and you start to say to yourself as you're reading this, what? The government fell over that? The government fell over this? You know, and it's sort of a succession of Liz Truss governments, isn't it?
That's a really good takeaway. Yeah.
It's one sort of Liz Truss in drag government, you know, because they all had bald heads, didn't they? But it's sort of, you know, it's sort of amazing to me the way that, and also that comes, then you get to understand why Hitler doesn't actually campaign in elections on the economic situation or the Wall Street crash. He campaigns on how crap the political situation is and how they can't agree in a coalition government of 4 or 5 parties that can only stay in power for 8 months maximum. So I think that's what people miss about Weimar. I blame the biographers of Hitler. They elevate his life too much. And as we know, they ignore a few things in his life that maybe should have been magnified a bit more, like his sexuality, for example. Maybe it's not even mentioned in Kershaw's book, biographies. And yet it is important, as I show, it is important in understanding Hitler and the early Nazi movement.
And thank you for that. And another point I want to bring up is also perhaps with the 2020 hindsight, and Ludendorff has come up a lot in the sidebar. So I'm going to ask you to kind of talk about him as well, is that it's only perhaps with a lens later on we can realize there were also opportunists involved. There are these people who clearly have a vision for something communist, those who want something more right-wing, those who want to genuinely try and restore Germany's pride or help the economy, but they're also just individuals who are really only interested in their own individual power. And sometimes that isn't easy to see until after the event, because at the time you think, you know, we can think about modern politics. There's someone I'll spot and I think they genuinely care about the world, but then you realize later on all they care about was their own position within it. So during this Weimar era, are there people you would kind of give that label of opportunists?
Yeah, I think many of them were opportunists who were trying to overthrow the system. Hitler was certainly an opportunist who played on events, if you like. He looked at events and tried to exploit them. Erich Ludendorff, he was really upset about Hindenburg. He felt Hindenburg had betrayed him towards the end of the war by not sticking by him when they decided to go for an armistice. And he said that Hindenburg wanted to go for an armistice too. And he also favoured the stab in the back myth, did Ludendorff. So did Hindenburg. This idea that Germany wasn't defeated on the battlefield, that German countryside was untouched by the war, and that Germany was stabbed in the back by socialists, by Jews, by Democrats at home. They were sort of gathered together under the November criminals, if you like. And it makes Weimar the early Weimar is, it's like I say, in Weimar Germany, every night's all right for fighting. It's like, it's not just Saturday night, and there is a tremendous amount of political murder that goes on. I think there's 354 political murders. No one's ever seen that in a democratic society. That's something that's not quite right, is it, in a democratic society, to have so many democratic politicians getting assassinated? For example, the guy who signed the armistice, Matthias Herzberger, he's shot dead, followed and shot dead by a group called Organization Consul. They also follow Walter Rathenau. He's no less than the foreign minister who's just signed the Treaty of Versailles with Russia. He's shot dead in Berlin as he goes in his limo towards the foreign ministry. There are many communists who are shot dead. I mentioned Eisner before, but there are hundreds more communists who are shot dead as well. And we have a pattern here. The judges tend to be from the Kaiserreich period, and they tend to be very unsympathetic to anyone on the left, but they're quite sympathetic to people on the right. So you get, you know, Erzberger's killers get an amnesty after about 2 years. Rathenau's murderer gets an amnesty after 4 or 5 years, doesn't serve the time. And of course, the greatest example is Hitler, who tries this Munich beer hall putsch in November 1923. And of course, all he seizes is a beer hall. He doesn't really seize that for long. And then the army and the police stay loyal. And the next day, 16 Nazis are shot. Hitler's arrested. He's put on trial. But the judge allows him to use the court as a kind of speaker's corner. He just lets him give speeches, which are anti-democratic all the way through the trial. And he says, I'll be tried in this court, he said, but I won't be tried in the court of justice on high. He said, it will free me eventually. And he said, it's Herbert who should be on trial for treason. And of course, he goes to jail. Why? He only serves, you know, he goes to jail in April 1924. He served 5 or 6 months before that. And he only serves another 9 months after that. And he's released in December 1924, and then he starts writing Mein Kampf in the prison, and he goes on to produce these 2 volumes of Mein Kampf. What he learns from his prison escapade is that Germany can't be, he does say, you know, the German state is too strong now to be overthrown by a group of renegades. So he says, I'm not going to go down that route anymore of standing out on the streets. I'm going to sit in the citadels of power now. I'm going to try and come to power through the ballot box. And it seems impossible. You know, the Nazis have got less than 2% of the votes at that stage when he comes out of prison. Doesn't look like the Nazis have any chance. Be 1,000,000 to 1 if there were bookmakers around at that time.
But it does coincide with this sort of stable period. I mean, I would think now it's sort of, they're papering over the cracks a little bit, but the economy kind of gets sorted out. Things are looking a bit better. There are these coalitions. None of them are perfect, but there's 4 or 5 years of relative stability in which, you know, he just sits there kind of monitoring things and being a little bit more clever than he had been earlier. You know, just watching and waiting his time. Then by 2930, it all kind of comes to a head again with other things, not least of which the Wall Street crash, which affects economy around the world. And I think I'll let you talk in a second. One of my takeaways from your book is I think I've been guilty of focusing on just Germany itself and what's happening within Germany, yet the influence of what's happening around it, you know, its neighbors in Europe, but also the wider world, I think is something, as you said yourself, really, the focus on Hitler has kept our lens rather narrow when actually a wider look is more important. Exactly. So how would you define kind of that stable period that isn't?
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. I think that period, as you say, what people forget is that they're concentrating on little meetings, you know, like the biographies of Hitler are concentrating on little meetings in Bamberg and the urban plan and all of this, and they're ignoring the international dimensions. Yeah. One politician stands out in that period, Gustav Stresemann. He's the foreign minister, and he single-handedly transforms Germany's image in the world. So Germany had been seen as a bit of and it was really, I mean, when you look at it, it was acting like a bit of a spoiled child and a bit of a nuisance, never paying its reparations, refusing to enter into any agreement whereby they would pay their reparations until the Dawes Plan gives them money to pay their reparations. Now, anyone would accept that gig. You know, if you owed money, and then someone comes around and says, here's your money to pay this week's rent. You say, oh, great. I'm about 80% of my rent paid by this nice guy. But what Stresemann does is he decides that he's got to get Germany better with France, because France is still sort of smarting from the First World War. It's been decimated. It's come out of it with a strong army. That's true. It's got an army of 1.5 million. It doesn't need to be afraid of Germany. Germany's only got an army of 100,000. As long as it keeps Germany's army low and its army high, it need not be afraid of Germany. But it is. It's sort of got this idea that Germany will shuffle all this, aggravation Germany's given the world is designed to shuffle off the Treaty of Versailles to get the Allies to say, oh, we're fed up with this argument. Let's do away with the Treaty of Versailles, which many in Germany wanted. And this intransigence was what was the problem. So Stresemann does something different. He tries to get on with the French, he develops a great relationship with ushered, the French foreign minister.
Mm-hmm.
And through that, they come up with the Locarno treaties of 1925. And they are very significant because Germany accepts its western borders. It accepts the demilitarization of the Rhineland. It accepts the 13% loss of colonies. It says it won't adjust the boundaries in the east by force, meaning, it might be by negotiation, but even that's a big step that they're taking. So people are sort of saying about Stresemann, he's really turned Germany's reputation around here through the Locarno treaties. Then he joins the League of Nations, Germany now becoming part of the body that sort of enacts the Versailles settlement. They couldn't be part of the whole gig. The kind of November criminals is losing weight now because of this. Germany is becoming a good citizen. And then in 1928, Germany signs the Kellogg-Briand Pact, and this renounces war as an instrument of policy. And the London Times says, well, look at this. Germany, the warmonger before the First World War, the one we said was guilty of starting the First World War, is now saying it's not going to use war as an instrument of policy. So that's how far Germany had come. But there was a little problem, really, because Stresemann in his diaries writes, at around 1929, he writes, what people don't realize is we're totally reliant on these American loans. They're short-term loans. They only run around, every 6 months, roll around every 6 months. He says, if they stop, then we're dancing on a volcano. And so he recognizes that the German economy could collapse if the loans dry up. And two things happened in 1929. I would say the first one is probably more important than the second one. On the 3rd of October, 1929, Gustav Stresemann dies, aged just 51. And he's been ill, and I catalogue, it's quite poignant, actually, when you read my book. You see him, he's always in hospital, isn't he? Or he's in a sanatorium, or he's got a doctor with him at Geneva and all this kind of thing. And he had a poor heart all the way through, and he died of a massive stroke. And that's a huge gap then. Here's Germany's Gorbachev, and we know what happened after Gorbachev, don't we?
Yeah.
Collapsed in Russia, didn't it, really? And I say it's the same in Germany. Once Germany's Gorbachev dies, it sort of collapses in Germany, really. The political system now has got nobody of that caliber. You can see that guy would have influence, wouldn't he? He had influence in Europe. He had influence over America. He had influence over Hindenburg as well. He respected him. The Social Democratic Party, they loved Stresemann. So there was a kind of coalition built in to his foreign policy as well. And then on the 29th of October, the Wall Street crash happens. And that takes us to the last period from 30 to 33, when Hitler now starts to rise.
And I'm glad you talked today and in the book about Stresemann, because I think I've been guilty of neglecting him as how significant he was, and and his death, as you said, there really tragic, and not just for his wife, but for the world potentially, because of what happened next. And we only have to look on Amazon and realize how many books there are about the rise of the Third Reich, and I am assuming that when people tackle that subject, as you have yourself, how much backstory to put in is a kind of a decision to make, because as you said there, you've got to kind of almost go back to the 19th century and how Germany was as Europe was in kind of princedoms and fiefdoms and empires, and all of those things are significant as you one by one along this route there. But at the same time, people like just reading about Hitler and the Nazis, and so I can understand why these other figures have been pushed aside. I think it's wrong they've been pushed aside, but I can understand why they have been. But it does bring us that 29-30 period.
I think that my book on the Weimar, I think if you read them in conjunction with the Hitler years books, you'll really see how much of the 20s resonates into the 30s.
Yeah,
you can really see by looking at my book about the French, the way the French act in the 20s and the way they act in the 30s, really. You can see that, they take a belligerent attitude, don't they, in the 20s? That's what people are asking for, isn't it, in 1936, for the French to take a belligerent attitude against it, and they don't do so. Now, that's because of what happens in the 20s, I think. And then when you read that, you understand the 30s period much more clearly than you did. And you understand that Hitler comes out of nowhere, really. You know, he completely comes out of nowhere. In some of them chapters, he's hardly mentioned.
Yeah.
Doing anything. The chapters are about what happened in that year. And I think this focus I did on the year by year thing, I think it pays off in the long run. If you go through all of the 3 volumes, I think it pays off. You understand more of this Hitler period now, because it's not just about Hitler. There are other people involved. The mistakes of the Social Democrats. Why did they stay out of government when they held the balance of power? It seemed like, you know, government without responsibility, didn't it? They could bring down all those governments, and they did. Mostly the Social Democrats between 23 and 28 brought down the other governments as and when they liked, and then they wouldn't go into the next government. So they lost credibility, I think, and they were the main supporters of the Republic. So that was a tragedy as well. I think what happens after 1930 is that when you follow the sort of breakdown of the Reichstag Parliament, which is well documented in my book, you see why Hindenburg gets fed up. He's an army man. He keeps saying to the people around him, you know, I want things done. If I give an order, I want it followed. And he can't get his head around the idea of coalition government. And so when General von Schleicher says, look, you don't have to have a coalition government. You've got Article 48 of the Constitution. It allows you to govern by decree separate from the Reichstag. You can appoint a chancellor who speaks for you in the Reichstag, but even if he gets voted down, you can pass his laws. He forgot that the Reichstag had the power to suspend parliament, though, and call elections. And that's what they did in 1930. His first presidential chancellor is Heinrich Brüning, who's a member of the Catholic Centre Party. He's not its leader, but he goes along with this idea of an austerity. What Germany needs to get through the depression is austerity, you know, cutting public expenditure, doing what they should have done earlier in the decade, letting unemployment rise, you know, to a level of when people go back to work, the economy has took off again. He believed in that. He believed in austerity and the kind of balanced budget. But he wasn't the only one. You know, the British believed in the balanced budget, and they ended up with a national government, didn't they? So it wasn't just him who believed this sort of doctrine of austerity at that time. But what it does is the election is called, and the Nazi Party has been growing in support in local areas. And in September 1930, the Nazi Party suddenly breaks through. It gains 107 seats. It goes from 2.8% to 19.7%, from 800,000 in 1928 to 6.7 million. Now it's the second most popular party in Germany. But where does it break through? This is where people sort of miss out the Wall Street crash. If the Wall Street crash, which so many of these general histories and biographies, was the reason Hitler broke through, then he should have been gaining seats in industrial areas, because that's where all the high unemployment came from heavy industry. But he doesn't. It's the communists who gain in the big cities and the Social Democrats. The Nazis can't break through in the big cities. He breaks through in rural areas. He breaks through in specific rural areas, Protestant areas with less than 5,000 inhabitants, who are mainly made up of self-employed people and pensioners. That's where he breaks through. And when you look at the people who vote for him, 24%, this is an amazing figure, really. 24% of those who vote for Hitler in 1930's breakthrough election have never voted before in any election. So what do we put that down to? Nazi propaganda. And that's where Hitler does break through. His propaganda, which is led by Joseph Goebbels, is superb. He creates a speakers bureau. So Hitler can't go to all these, you know, hundreds of little towns. So he creates speakers who can sort of become kind of Hitler clones. And they go out to these small areas preaching the gospel of hate that is Nazism. And they pitch themselves on the idea that we need to get rid of the political system. It's the political system that's rotten, you know, in the state of Weimar Germany. It's democracy that's rotten, and we'll replace it with a dictator that will create a national community that everyone can feel part of. And you don't need elections in that type of community. And that seems to resonate. They gained 24% from the DNVP, that's the Conservative Party, and they gained 20% from pensioners. Why did they gain from pensioners? Well, pensioners' savings were wiped out in the Great Inflation. So there's a kind of a laggard of the Great Inflation that comes into it then. So Hitler breaks through in small cities with self-made individuals, the self-employed, right? They've got jobs. He breaks through with the plumbers. They've got jobs. They haven't not got jobs. The ones who were unemployed, they vote for the communists. See, so the Wall Street crash is not a factor in that first breakthrough.
Wow. Well, people are saying just what a brilliant analysis this is, and clearly, you know, Joseph Goebbels' influence is massive, and just how they assembled and did these talks and rallies, and the use of oratory and imagery and colors.
Airplane to fly from town to
but also how much of this, these small towns where the Nazis are gaining, how much of it is also just they're fed up themselves with the previous system? These coalitions haven't really been working. Is it just they want something new as well, and it doesn't really matter what the new is as long as it's new?
They feel in the rural areas that there needs to be a rural New Deal. You know, that really that they haven't been keeping up with inflation because they've got trade unions. A plumber can't get an inflation proof rise, can he? So that's what happens. The agriculture doesn't recover in the 24-29 period. It's still pretty stagnant in that period as well, and that's what people don't really get their head around. It's in the rural areas places happen, and what happens is politics is becoming fragmented because the middle class, because of the great inflation, have lost confidence in democracy, remember. And that's a really big problem, because in most democracies, the middle class favor democracy. They are the bulwark of democracy. You know, people say, why haven't we had a revolution in Britain? Because we had a strong Conservative Party that mopped up the middle classes, gripes, and put them into policy and changes all the time. And the German Conservative Party was not like that at all. It moved further and further to the right, so that by 1932, it was almost a kind of clone of the Nazi Party by that time.
We've got a question from Andreas, who's one of our resident German viewers. Can Frank talk about the Black Reichswehr and the cooperation with the Soviets in 1933?
Well, the collaboration started after Rapallo. You know, after the Treaty of Rapallo, the Reichswehr, as it was called, the reconstituted German army, started to have talks with the Russians and started to allow training. For example, for Luftwaffe pilots, they also trained them in strategy as well. They came to Germany and they went to Potsdam, and they trained Russian officers in war strategy as well. So a lot of that went on, and there were a few, as I mentioned in the book, don't I? There's a few scandals in there where the German government is exposed because a scandal has erupted. You know, like there's a scandal that breaks in the Manchester Guardian, isn't there? That that reveals that the German democratic government is actually getting ammunition from the Soviet Union as well. So yes, that was already happening. There were training centers, there were those things. But of course, Hitler sort of puts a kibosh on that in 1933. Instead of sort of building on that collaboration, which would have helped his rearmament, he sort of shuts down, doesn't he, relations with the Soviet Union.
Well,
but of course, it comes back, doesn't it? That's always that thing, isn't it? Should Germany look to the west, or should Germany look to the east?
Yeah.
You know, and if it's looking to the east, then the obvious ally is the Soviet Union. Of course, in 1939, the logic of the Rapallo Accord comes back again. Is it, how can we box the West in? Do what we did in 1922, sign an agreement with the Soviet Union. So it was always something that was there, really, in foreign policy, military psyche.
Okay. Well, one thing we haven't mentioned, and Michael Nelson's just asking, is, was there anything that broke down through religious divisions? Because we haven't talked about the fact that Europe in the 20s and 30s was essentially still God-believing, albeit different versions of that. But does religion play any part in these 20s and 30s?
Does, yeah. It does, yes, because I just mentioned, didn't I? All the people who vote for Hitler are Protestants. So the first breakthrough is Protestants. He appeals to Protestants, even though he's a Catholic. And there is a party in Germany. It's wholly religious, the Catholic Centre Party, Zentrum. And Zentrum has about, it's got about 100 seats. It's got about 6 million voters. And if you look at a graph of Weimar Germany, you'll notice that some of the things go up and down for the parties, but Zentrum stays the same. Why? Because they are anti-Nazi. Zentrum, Catholics were anti-Nazi. Priests were anti-Nazi as well. Hitler said himself, these priests are preaching from the pulpit, if you vote Nazi, you'll be excommunicated. And that was going on. There was pressure, and they did bow to that pressure. So the religion wasn't something of belief. It was more something of sort of, your area is Protestant, your area is Catholic. So it's related like that. There's about a 70-30 split in 70 Protestant, 30 Catholic. So although they were a minority, obviously the people who voted Zentrum were all Catholics. It was,
right. Okay. We've got another interesting. We talked at the very beginning about how the Weimar Republic is overlooked generally, and a question about how it has been portrayed from Carl Mackenzie here. What does Professor McDonough think of portrayals of the Weimar like Babylon Berlin or Cabaret? So that period has come up in novels and books and things like that. So what do you think about Cabaret and Babylon Berlin?
Well, I mean, look, everybody knows, Weimar has got a kind of sexy image, hasn't it? And it's like, oh, we want to hear about the sexy image of Weimar. And some idiots are still going around saying we should only look at the sexy bit. We shouldn't look at the politics and the rise of it. We should just look at the sexy bits. And that's what survived, as if it was a legacy that survived. And of course, the culture was amazing. I think that the Bauhaus movement, for example. It was influential on architecture. I would say badly influential, because all of the terrible housing estates I lived around when I was about 16 were all right out of Bauhaus, and all East Germany. If you ever went to East Germany before the wall came down, the bloody whole thing was Bauhaus in that stage. I don't think it was necessarily a great way of living, let's say. People didn't like living in those big shoe boxes, did they? They preferred to have a garden, which Bauhaus forgot. And, Bauhaus had an influence on, household things. It's a big influence on bungalows. People forget that. They popularized bungalows. They also popularized modern kitchen units as well.
Yeah.
And then the famous Vasily chair, isn't there? That's the one I like, is the chess set with no monarchical pieces. It's bloody hard to play.
Yeah, I've seen that. Yeah.
Much harder to play than the original one. And then there's the tea infuser. Some people still buy this stuff, this Weimar stuff. And the cabaret scene. The cabaret scene, I would say, was mainly in Berlin. There was 100 nightclubs in Berlin. There was an English guide called A Guide to Berlin's Depravity, where they told you where you could go. But these nightclubs, they weren't, they weren't all nice and lovely. They were basically brothels.
It wasn't much romance.
They were basically brothels, and half of it there were cubicles around the back. So and also, what is forgotten? No, it's a bit like, like the Summer of Love, like everything was going on in 1967 down Carnaby Street. Where I was living, there was no Summer of Love.
Yeah, it was a very small minority. My mum and dad missed it.
Kick your head in. And you had a short back and sides, not big long hair, because your dad wouldn't let you. And these are myths, aren't they? The Summer of Love.
Yeah.
The Weimar culture was dominating everything. No, it wasn't. It was greatly contested as well. People forget there were demonstrations outside these Berlin nightclubs after 1930 by the stormtroopers. There were also demonstrations to ban the film All Quiet on the Western Front, and that was successful. So culture, unlike Babylon, it's a bit like nostalgia, isn't it? It's the nostalgia thing, in the 1970s. Oh, look, ABBA. wow, it's great, it's fantastic. So like, what they don't tell you is that there was a toilet paper strike in
Yeah,
19.
the strikes, the power shortages.
Weeks. I remember my mum getting her bags back saying, "There's no toilet paper," because there was a strike. So people forget all that stuff with nostalgia. That's the danger of nostalgia. And I think this Babylon Berlin Cabaret, to that extent, it's a stylized version of what was happening.
It's sanitized, stylized, romanticized. Yeah,
romanticized, and that really wasn't the truth. It was really tough to be a pioneer in any field at that time.
So it brings us to, I think, possibly the last question, because in addition to writing the books, of course, you've had a career teaching people as well. You've been out there telling these history to young people, and we don't need to be reminded that teaching about the Third Reich is important. Teaching about the Holocaust, of course, that's essential. But the Weimar Republic, and Andreas's question is, can Frank elaborate on the lessons we can learn for today? So what should we be learning about the Weimar Republic today in 2023? Is it part of the Nazi story? Is it sort of separate or related to it?
Well, I think it's a lesson of democracy, isn't it? How can democracy protect itself? Because here was a situation where President Hindenburg abused Article 48 to destroy the Weimar Republic and to bring Hitler to power, knowing that he probably would have brought in a dictatorship. So we need some safeguards, don't we? Democracy just doesn't need to be, I'm free to say what I want and do what I want. To safeguard democracy, you need safeguards.
Yeah.
You need very strong safeguards. There was no safeguard here in this system. There should have been a safeguard. Maybe the parliament didn't act enough. They could have impeached Hindenburg, by the way, and they could have got a majority for that, but they didn't do it quick enough. Now, that's what they should have done. They did have a mechanism to impeach him, but the Social Democrats didn't use it. They just threatened him with it. And he was worried about it. That's why he went back to a coalition government in 1933. He feared he was going to get impeached. So I would say the lesson of it is that, beware people who offer you nothing, because Hitler offered people nothing. He didn't offer them employment. He didn't offer them economic policies, never mentions an economic policy. I've read all of his speeches on the campaign trail for these elections. He offers them to destroy democracy. That's what he's offering. And the other point here is that people need to be aware of how valuable their vote is.
Yeah.
Because here we have a situation where 13.7 million people vote for the Nazi Party, which is going to destroy democracy. 13.7 million people. So they put Hitler in the position where he had to be sort of brought in and offered the chancellorship in the first place. And we've got to think about that. Who do we vote for and why are we voting for them? Because if you vote for somebody, you've got to be clear what they're going to do. I see people now, don't you, say, oh, bloody Boris Johnson. Oh, look at the disaster he brought. Yeah. But 13 million people voted for him.
Yeah. It's like turkeys voting for Christmas, isn't it, Frank?
Yeah, Christmas, and you've got to have some. My view is democracy can survive, but you've got to make sure you've got safeguards within it. I don't think we've got enough safeguards in Britain. We've got an unwritten constitution. You can basically do what you like, as long as you vote through Parliament.
Yeah, no, it's shown itself up a couple of times in the recent years of the fact that we don't really have a written constitution. Is people have to kind of then contact lawyers at the last minute. So is this? Can we do this? Is this constitutional? We've gone down a rabbit hole. But one last question from Nige, who was also at We Have Ways and saw you talk with Paul McGann there. But he's saying, what effect did Stalin's orders to the KPD to not work with the Social Democrats have? Could an alliance between the KPD and the Social Democrats have blocked the Nazis through elections or force?
I think that the orders they took from Stalin came sort of after the Spartacus revolt. They were already against working with the Social Democrats then, and of course Stalin's orders, obviously they had an impact because they refused to work with the Social Democrats. I think if they could have got the Catholic Centre Party with the Communists and the Social Democrats, there was a majority for that. For that pairing in the Reichstag. So it would have been a possibility if they hadn't been alienated from each other. So yes, the schism on the left did make a difference.
And now, you know, in reading your book and the two that follow it chronologically, there were lots of opportunities for things to have changed. This route wasn't predetermined completely. There were lots of moments where it could have steered left or right, but it wasn't quite the inevitable plunge into chaos that perhaps we think it is. It as you said, people didn't use their vote wisely. People were ignoring what was going on around them. And I say that the turkeys voting for Christmas comment, I think, comes back, is that it tripped up so many times where it could have halted, and it didn't.
Yeah, of course. You know, I think that's my main takeaway of the way that people underestimated Hitler, and everybody did. You know, everybody underestimated him one way or another. But on the 30th of January 1933, Ernst Thälmann, he's the Communist Party leader, he wrote this in his diary. He said, so Hitler's become Chancellor. He'll last 3 weeks. I'm off to Lichtenberg to play Skittles. And 2 weeks later, he's in a concentration camp. And in 1944, he's killed on the orders of Hitler.
That is a perfect way of summing things up, Frank. We can't top that, except we have had people asking, what are you doing next? You completed your trilogy. What's the next project for Mr. McDonough?
I can't say at the moment. You know, the publisher won't let me, but it'll be something connected with Germany.
Okay, what a surprise.
So I'll either go forward or backward.
Okay. Well, Frank, it's been an absolute delight talking to you, and I'll hold up my copy of the book again. And listening to you and riff today, and the bungalows and coming up in the conversation, bog roll strikes. I think it's that kind of sprawling conversation that I really enjoy. And I say the book is doing well. The previous two are, you know, they're not I remember you saying in the first interview with me that it's not like I would not want to use the words definitive, because you're a great believer in history being reanalyzed and the next generation looking at your work and building on it. But
yeah, exactly.
It's sort of a complete volume that you can have and understand the spirit.
Only thing I'll say is this is the most up to date version of it. There'll be another one along, you know, 8 years time about somebody else, a younger person, and then there'll be another one, you know.
Brilliant.
You've got young historians waiting in the wings already, haven't you? Know?
Well, exactly. Katia Hoyer will I'm sure do something.
Decide to do a big 3-volume history later in her career. So that's what I think people should do towards the end of their career, because I started this in the last years I was teaching. So I started it then, 2016 I started the project, and 2022 I ended it. So it's not bad, 3 volumes. And
no, not bad at all. So we'll leave it there. So thank you, Frank. Thank you, everybody, for your insightful comments and questions. And go out and get the book. And folks, I will see you again tonight when we're talking about the massacre of the Italian division in 1943 on the 80th anniversary. So cheers, everybody. Don't forget to check out the links. I will see you all next time. Bye.